Read just one verse this morning. This is from the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11. These words are spoken to the Israelites when they were in captivity in Babylon. God says, "I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." We're here at the beginning of a new year, and nobody knows what this year is going to bring, just like any other year. Some of what happens in this new year may be better than we expect, and some may be worse. We just don't know. I came across a few predictions from people in the past. This was from Thomas Watson, who was the chairman of IBM. This was from 1943 when he was asked to comment on that newfangled invention called the computer. He said, "I think that there is a world market for maybe 5 computers at the most." We probably have 5 computers in our house right now if you count our phones. Here's what inventor Lee DeForest said about the possibility of television. He said, "While theoretically and technically television may be feasible, commercially and financially it would never succeed." Well, of course, he was wrong. And in 1972, the Decca Recording Company made this prediction about a new band from Liverpool, England. "We don't like their sound, and guitar music is on the way out." Anybody know who that band was? The Beatles, right? So who knows what this new year is going to bring? There are some things we can know, and we can know them with absolute certainty. And they're in the verse that I read to you this morning. And I'll narrow it down to just one thought that I want you to take away from this, the thing that you can know with absolute certainty about this coming year, and that is that God has plans for you. He has plans for your life. Look at what verse 11 says. "I know the plans I have for you." Have you ever felt like God had just forgotten about you? That God was just not aware of the things that were going on in your life? I imagine that's how the Israelites felt when God spoke these words to them. They were in captivity. They had lost a war to a much stronger nation, Babylon. Many of them had been carried off by force from their home country to another country to work as servants. And they were there in captivity not for a week, not for a month, not even for a year. They were there for 70 years. Do you think at any point during those 70 years those Israelites might have, even either in their own private thoughts or maybe as they got together and talked, they might have said something like, "I think God forgot about us. I don't think he knows we're here. I don't think he cares." And so God speaks these words to them and he says, "I know the plans I have for you." And this message from God to the Israelites was a reminder of his faithfulness. It didn't seem like it, and that's one of the reasons, we talk a lot about the promises of God in the Bible, and there are hundreds of them. One of the reasons these promises are in the Bible, it's not just to inform us, that's part of it, but it's to remind us of things that are not always apparent. When God says, "I know the plans I have for you," and he's promising us that he has a plan for us, that's in the Bible because it's not always apparently true. It's not always obvious. We can't just pick at any point in our life and say, "Well, clearly God has a plan for me." And so these promises are given to remind us. God is at work in your life right now. Even though you may not see it, even though you may not know it, he's at work in your life to prepare things for the future. Look at what the rest of that verse says. "I know the plans I have for you, plans to give you a future and a hope. That's the very thing that the Israelites were lacking at that time. They had bread, food, enough for the day, but they were slaves in a foreign country. The one thing that it looked like they didn't have was a future. The one thing they were lacking was hope. And so God says to them, my plans are to give you a future and a hope. The great example of this in the Bible, of course, is Moses. Moses lived to be 120 years old, and his life divides neatly up into 3 40-year sections. And most of what we know about him comes from either the first 40 years, found as a baby in a basket, raised in the palace of the Pharaoh as the Pharaoh's adopted grandson, the last 40 years as he leads the Israelites out of bondage into the promised land, going through the wilderness. We know those 2 sections. The middle section we don't know a whole lot about, or we don't talk a whole lot about, but it's significant. Now, you may remember that Moses had killed, when he was living in the palace of the Pharaoh, he had killed an Egyptian soldier because the soldier had beaten a Hebrew, one of the Hebrew slaves, and Moses saw it and he was indignant. And in his anger and fury, he killed that Egyptian soldier, tried to bury him and left one of the feet sticking up. And he had to flee. He had to leave Egypt, had to leave the life of luxury behind. He was on what we would say, he was living on Easy Street, and he had to leave that behind. And he fled to a place called Midian. And if you don't know a whole lot about Midian, that's kind of the point. It was a nowhere place. It was way out in the middle of nowhere. In fact, there was a mountain in Midian to show you how isolated and desolated this place was. That was the name of the mountain, the Mount of Desolation. We know it by its other name in the Bible, Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. Moses got to Midian, met a beautiful young woman, married her. Her dad's name was Jethro, and Moses went to work for Jethro as a shepherd, but didn't have his own animals, didn't have his own flocks, didn't have his own business. He went from living in a palace to one of the most powerful men in Egypt to working for his father-in-law in a place that was so isolated it was called Desolation. And he did that not just for a month or 2 or 3, he did it for 40 years. What does 40 years in the wilderness prepare you for? Exactly what God was about to ask Moses to do, to lead the Israelites out of bondage into the promised land by way of the wilderness, where they would spend 40 years wandering. See, Moses didn't know it, but God was at work in his life preparing him for the future. And when God needed to find Moses, he didn't have to look up MapQuest to see, well, I wonder where Moses is. He knew exactly where Moses was, even though he was out in the middle of a wilderness called Desolation. And it's so beautiful. It's in Exodus 3. It's that time when God speaks to Moses through the burning bush, and he's out there, Moses is, with his animals, and God doesn't shout out, hey shepherd, you. He knows exactly not just where he is, but who he is. And he calls him by name, Moses. God had plans for Moses, even when it didn't seem like it. God had plans for the Israelites, even when they were in bondage, and he has plans for you this coming year. Now, if you're thinking, well, that sounds so wonderful, there has to be a but in there somewhere. There is. And the but is this: God knows the plans, but you don't. Look at what he says. I know the plans I have for you. Now, implied in that is you don't. And here's the thing, God's not going to tell you in advance what they are. That would be great, wouldn't it? If God would say, now here are my plans for you. I know things look terrible right now, but 8 months from now, everything's going to turn around and it's going to be great. We'd love that, except for the fact that the Bible tells us that we have to live by faith. And if God told us what his plans were in advance, we'd stop living by faith, we'd start living by sight, and we'd just sit around and wait for God to do what he promised he was going to do. One of my favorite Christian writers was a man named Oswald Chambers. Died a tragic death young during one of the great world wars. But he wrote this. This is very profound. It's just a sentence, but listen to what he said. God never reveals what he is going to do. He only reveals who he is. Isn't that profound? Isn't that wonderful? God never reveals what he's going to do. He only reveals who he is. You don't have to know what God's going to do if you know who God is. And if you know that God is faithful to his people, it doesn't matter what he's going to do. It's going to be good, right? If you know that God keeps his promises, you don't have to know what those promises are going to be or when they're going to be. You just have to know that God's going to do it. The just shall live by faith. Both testaments say that. And that's what God reveals himself to. You ever wonder, well, maybe God doesn't reveal himself enough to me, or I don't see him enough in my life? The probability is that you're not living by faith. You're living by sight. You're wanting God to explain everything, to show you everything. When God is saying, look, just trust me. Just trust me. Day by day. And that's our job, isn't it? To just be faithful. We don't have to know when. We don't even have to know what. We just have to know that God is going to do it. And so that's the thing that we can do. Just be faithful in your present circumstances. I've always admired Mother Teresa, the Catholic nun who spent her life in India working with the poor. Not a lot of people know that Mother Teresa, during most of her time there, I don't want to say she had lost her faith. That might be a bit of an overstatement, but she struggled with her faith mightily. And so you know what she did? She just kept on working. Just kept on serving the Lord. Kept on doing the things she knew to be right. And now that she's dead, she's revered around the world for the faithfulness that she exhibited. She said this once when a reporter asked her how she measured the success of her work. She said, I don't remember that Jesus ever said anything about success. He just spoke about being faithful. And to me, that's the only success that counts. And so look for opportunities to serve God in your circumstances, at home, at work, here at church. Be faithful to God, knowing that God is at work in your life. So God has plans for you, but you won't know what they are in advance. And be faithful to God while he's working. You know, you can do mighty things for God in the smallest, most insignificant of circumstances. A few years ago, on one of our trips to Sequoia National Park, we were walking in a field. Their cabin where we were staying, there's a little wilderness sort of area that you have to go through to get to a river. I guess that's the Kaweah River that runs through there. And daily we walked from our cabin to that river. And one day as we were walking, going through this field, I spotted a little, because it's wilderness. It looks barren. It almost looked desert-like. And I spotted a splash of color out of the corner of my eye. And I looked down, and there out in this field, out in the middle of nowhere, was the most beautiful little patch of wildflowers. And I mean, they were blue and purple and red and orange. They were gorgeous. And I had the thought, I wonder if I'm the only person who's seen these flowers. Maybe today, maybe for a week, who knows? But there they were, blossoming where God had planted them. Beautiful. In a sense, just their very existence offered as a praise to God, to the glory of God. And I thought about how many people live lives like that. They're out of the way, they don't seem significant, they don't seem important, hardly anybody notices what they're doing, but they just live lives of faithfulness to God. for the glory of God. And that's something you can do. You may not be, a movie star that everybody in the world knows what your name is. Just be faithful. Bloom where God planted you. Be faithful to God, knowing that as you serve him, God is at work in your life. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this promise from your word that you are at work in our lives. We praise you for that. Help us to be faithful in what you have called us to do, even if no one else is watching. Help us to bloom where we are planted for your glory. We pray this in Jesus' name.